Welcome back. You're watching Signature TV, and this is Signature Morning. We continue our discussion on health, and this time around, we're narrowing it down to pneumonia as a health issue in children. We have with us Dr. Obinna Nduaguba. Good to have you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Good
Good
morning.
morning, our viewers.
What is pneumonia, and how does it affect kids?
Okay, so pneumonia, simply in a simple way, it's infection involving the lungs. The lungs are the bags through which we breathe as human beings. So it's a very important organ that's responsible for our exchange, intake and exchange of air, which is key to our body function. So when the lungs are inflamed or infected, inflammation or infection involving the lungs is typically simply what we call pneumonia. And there are several things that can cause that, ranging from bacteria, viruses, even fungal organisms can cause pneumonia.
Where does this fungi bacteria come from for the kids?
Readily, these are things that we have from the air, suspended in the air, okay, through surfaces, okay, and then some can be from droplets from others that have that, okay, and it's suspended in the air, and as we breathe, we inhale some of these organisms. And so when they get into our airway, they find the environment conducive, they attach to the inner line of our airway, and then they settle and begin to multiply. A couple of times, without our knowledge, our bodies are able to fight off some of these organisms without our knowing. And so a good number of times we encounter these organisms, but we don't come down with infections or diseases because our body immune system fight them off. But occasionally our body is overwhelmed, and that is when we now begin to have signs and symptoms, and which are typically, fever, fast or difficult breathing, cough, chest pain. Okay, smaller children, they may have refusal of feeds. Okay, change in color. Okay, from pink color to blue, particularly when it's severe. And then even in severe cases, extreme difficulty in breathing, reduced level of consciousness, and so on and so forth. So the presentations are varied depending on the age. But typically, the very typical symptoms remain the fast or difficult breathing, the fever, and the cough.
All
Those
right.
are the three major features.
All right, Dr. Nduaguba, you're a pediatric doctor.
Pediatrician, yes.
That means that you're a doctor for kids, for children. Now, how does pneumonia affect children differently? Because you mentioned the factor here, age as a factor. So how does it affect kids differently?
Okay, so for children, at the extremes of age, generally, the immune system is not as in its best. And so they are vulnerable. They are a lot more vulnerable than others. So particularly for children less than 5, we have them much more vulnerable or susceptible to organisms that cause pneumonia because the immune system is not as primed as the adults would be. Okay, and more so when there are other immune suppressive states like malnutrition, HIV, diseases that suppress other comorbidities, okay, that can reduce the person's ability to fight infection. So in that case, even the child who is naturally vulnerable becomes even more vulnerable, and that makes it more difficult. And it's worrisome because in Nigeria, we're talking about Nigeria contributing close to 30% of the world global figure for childhood pneumonia. And that is worrisome. So our numbers as a country in some way is actually working against us. Nigeria has a huge population, and most of those population are actually the youth. Okay, so having that huge population and having some of these problems, the real numbers, the actual numbers of pneumonia cases in Nigeria becomes enormous. Take, for example, we have about 400,000 pneumonia deaths every year. And Nigeria, in the world, I'm talking about in developing world,
Okay.
we have over 400,000 deaths from pneumonia
Annually.
And Nigeria is contributing close to 150,000 of those deaths. Nigeria alone. Okay, so you can now understand the enormity of what we are talking about. But what is worrisome is that, and that is about 20% of the total deaths we have in children in Nigeria coming from pneumonia. Yes, we have other things that contribute more, like malaria contributes close to 30%, but pneumonia gives us about 20% of the total deaths we have in under 5s in Nigeria. But yet, despite that, we don't have very good support against pneumonia as it is. If you look at the world, even the funding for research in pneumonia It's not up to 3% of the total funds allocated to research for infectious diseases worldwide. And that is not good enough. Then we look at Nigeria, we don't have clear-cut funding for pneumonia as a disease.
Sorry, can I cut your train of
Yes,
thought?
go ahead.
You said research funds for research for pneumonia is not as much as that for infectious diseases.
No, I mean, among the research funds for infectious diseases,
Okay.
the total fund globally for infectious diseases, pneumonia doesn't have up to 3% of the total research funds for infectious disease.
I understand it
So
better.
despite its place, the global position it stands in terms of morbidity and mortality in the world, and more so in our own parts of the world.
All right, Doctor, growing up, there was this, I don't know whether it's a myth or fact, you're going to debunk it right now. You were told as a child, don't sleep under the fan, don't sleep on the bare floor, you could catch pneumonia. Is there some truth to this?
Well, it's not really as direct as it is. The only thing that appears that is a bit, some element of truth in that is that the viruses we know are a major cause of pneumonia. They thrive more in cold environments. Okay, so when the weather is cold, the viruses thrive more in cold environment. So in some way, okay, there's some little correlation, but it's not as if you stay in a cold environment, you get pneumonia. It doesn't work that way. You understand? So there are other things now that we need to look at, but there are other things that are involved. The bacteria, the fungal organisms, they're typical organisms. Just like the tuberculosis we are talking about is a type of pneumonia. Tuberculosis, yes, there's a lot of funding for TB. But again, we're talking about other aspects, other types of pneumonia. Okay, we have very little or no funding. We don't even have clear-cut programs for pneumonia alone. And that is why the Pediatric Association of Nigeria, PAN, which is a body of all pediatricians, that's all the doctors that handle children, all the doctors that specialists that handle children in the country, are taking out time to join the global community in creating awareness about pneumonia. Okay, and for this year, the theme is Every Breath Counts, Stop Pneumonia in Its Track. Okay, so the same thing is happening. So November 12th every year has been mapped out every year to create awareness about pneumonia. And this year we're talking about the urgency needed for us to do what? Detect pneumonia early, treat it, and also look at the preventive measures. Okay, because again, prevention remains better than cure. So in areas where we have preventive measures in place, okay, it helps us not to have much of those children coming down with these diseases. And then when we now have the diseases, we're able to detect them early and then begin to treat them and prevent what? The deaths or the morbidities that can occur from that particular disease. So when we look at pneumonia as a whole, it's a very big area. Okay, we've talked about the symptoms, we've talked about how it presents, we've talked about the available resources.
Doctor, I was going to ask, because you mentioned something instructive. You said that tuberculosis is a type of pneumonia.
Yes.
Now tell us, what are the clinical differences between tuberculosis and pneumonia? That is one. And then secondly, what are the signs that a mother would see in a child and say, oh, this is probably pneumonia, so that they can present early at the clinic?
Thank you very much. One, for the second aspect of what you asked, that's one thing that keeps confusing people. In fact, in our part of the world, a mother typically believes that any fever that a child has is malaria. And so they veer off, they even start giving paracetamol and other medications to suppress a fever, which is actually an outward sign that something is not right. Now, that fever that is showing that something is not right doesn't tell you this is malaria or this is this or that. It could be anything else. There are so many things that can present with fever. Okay, but now when there is fast breathing or difficulty in breathing added onto that fever and cough in addition, it further helps in narrowing down a lot more. And that is why there must be early presentation where a doctor can listen to that child's chest and hear the telltale signs of pneumonia. Okay, the crepitations or the decreased air entry and so on that would suggest a pneumonic feature. And of course, where they are in doubt, they can request for a chest X-ray. But the clinical diagnosis of pneumonia, straightforward pneumonia, is purely clinical, from the symptoms and from the chest examination findings by a doctor who is trained to do that. Now, the problem is when you now meet someone that doesn't know, the person may listen and may not hear anything because his ears are not trained for it. And so the person may end up continuing to treat malaria or any other infection cause of fever, when the patient might actually have a pneumonia. And when you lose all those opportunities to make the diagnosis, the lung tissues are increased. There is, gradually increase the percentage of the lung tissue that is damaged, and then with time, person will now begin to do what? Have progressive what? Difficulty in breathing. And when the lung tissues are extensively damaged, the person will go into failure. The lungs will fail, and when your lungs fail, you stop breathing. That's it. The person is gone. Okay, so for TB and pneumonia, the symptoms are similar, but TB runs a slightly, more chronic course. Okay, pneumonia can kill a lot shorter, but TB will run a longer course.
What that means?
So what I mean by chronic is that it stretches a lot more in symptomatology. To start with, in smaller children, you find them failing to thrive. A child that is eating is not gaining weight. You check the weight month to month, the child is not measuring up. Okay, or a child that was initially bigger before beginning to do what? To go down in weight. A child that had a normal weight at 3 months, at 4 months is going down. 5 months, rather than increasing, is rather stepping down. That's a cause for worry. Or a child that has a fever that has lasted for 2 weeks or more. That should make you worried about TB. Okay, or a child that is having drenching night sweats, okay, or cough that has lasted 2 weeks or more, fever, weight loss, or failure to thrive. These are the presumptive signs that will make you worried about TB. Okay, so if that is the case, then the person will have to now produce sputum or give us 2 samples for what we call gene expert. Gene expert is the most common available test that you can do to diagnose tuberculosis. Okay, and 2 samples can be taken. So if it's a smaller child, less than 5, I cannot give you quality sputum because most children of that age cannot really cough up sputum. When they cough, they swallow it. So for such a child, you are not relying on the sputum, which is what you cough up when you cough. What you rely more is on the stool. But even at that, the percentage yield from the lab for the stool may not be so good. Some reports at best 30%. So we now have opportunities for you to clinically make diagnosis of TB in children using the current WHO algorithm. But those things are to be done by health workers who are trained to do that.
2 key questions.
Yes.
One is, are there any improved nutrition that can be, embarked upon for you to be able to, stave off a kid from being infected by pneumonia? And what are the steps that parents can take in order to make sure that their kids are protected from pneumonia? Yes,
the basic things are there. For nutrition, key. We've talked about that the incidence of malnutrition is on the increase. We're moving from 17 to 21% to about 40% as we speak. And that is worrisome. And with the increase in percentage of children that are malnourished, all these diseases that are atypical, that are opportunistic, in the sense that they come in where there is what? Where the immunity is low, where the environment is conducive for them to thrive.
So they are opportunistic.
So yes, for TB particularly, they now come in and they find a resting room. Okay, so for TB, for example, yes, if the nutrition of these children are optimal, what do we have in the school feeding program? What do they have at home to eat? All these are telling on the economic indices in the country. So if the resources are there, the mothers are aware of how to combine what is available, the vegetables, the fruits, the sources of protein, and they're able to give balanced meals to these children, it will make them less likely to come down with pneumonia, particularly the tuberculosis. Apart from that, the living conditions. You find a family of 6, a man and wife and 4 children, even a man and wife and 6 children living in one room. Overcrowding is one of the things that perpetuates, that bring about risk factors for pneumonia generally, including the TB. Okay, and then we talk about poor sanitary conditions. Then you talk about what do they use to cook. By the time you have unclean sources of energy for cooking, the charcoal and the firewood, and the child is exposed to those fumes. These are things that make children more susceptible to pneumonias. But most mothers don't know. So they will carry a young baby, the child is crying, they're cooking in the kitchen, and the child is inhaling all that. They are making that child more susceptible to coming down with pneumonias. Then we'll talk about industrial fumes and smoke that come out, particularly for our young boys and girls that work at low levels in those industries and companies. These fumes which they generate also predispose them to pneumonias. So it's a whole gamut, of things which cut across so many other sectors of the economy. The housing, other living conditions that So the health sector cannot stay in isolation. All the sectors have to come up at their best for us to begin to have some of these things come down. And so when we look at the preventive measures, it's another kettle of fish. You must look at their housing conditions, you must look at the nutrition, you must look at the scientific conditions around them, health education, okay? Then you also look at availability, access to vaccines. We have a lot of vaccine preventable diseases, but access to these vaccines, some people still don't avail themselves of these vaccines. The pneumonia we talk about, yes, we have more of it in the north than in the south. Studies have shown that. Okay, but still, the same factors are in interplay, although more in the north. Okay, so access to vaccines. Most people find it difficult to accept and access vaccines. Some, when there is a little adverse effect on one person, they generalize. Okay, and we have a couple of vaccines that are targeted against pneumonia, starting from the BCG, which is given at birth, that targets tuberculosis. Now, BCG, yes, may not stop you from having TB, but it has been shown to protect against severe forms of TB. The TB that involves the brain, TB, what we call TB meningitis, and the miliary form of TB that causes severe, massive damage to the lungs, what we call the miliary TB. Okay, so in as much as it may not stop TB completely, but it has a lot of protection.
Does BCG protect against pneumonia?
No, BCG is for TB, which is a form of pneumonia. Now, after BCG, you have other vaccines. We have the pertussis, which is part of the penta. The pertussis is against another form of pneumonia called by Bordetella pertussis. Then we have the PCV, that's pneumococcal vaccine, which is against strep pneumonia, which is another common bacteria that causes pneumonia. Then we'll now come down to other things like the measles vaccine, because measles is not only the rash that you see on the body. Measles also causes what we call a pneumonia, measles pneumonia. So in severe cases, they can have a pneumonia, which can cause extensive lung damage as well. So if you look at these vaccines that we have and what they do for us, and we avail ourselves of those opportunities, it will help to reduce incidence of pneumonia in our children if they avail themselves of that. Even the Hague influenza type B, which is part of the penta, okay, that's also us. So when the children have these things and they are given, it helps. Now, like we said earlier, if we have booster doses of these vaccines in our NPI schedule, which PAN is propagating, PAN came up with an advocacy for increased booster doses to offer more protection, but it hasn't been accepted. It's still on the on the papers. It's still a paperwork. The advocacy hasn't yielded anything. So we still have very few booster doses, and that is also affecting our percentage protection. Because when you have additional booster doses, you have more people that are immune, and then you have a cover, what we call herd immunity, where a large population is now protected as a result of the fact that at least 80% of the population are protected from that particular disease.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the PAN, Pediatrics Association of Nigeria.
Yes.
Now, do they have a framework for awareness? You mentioned advocacy, but many of these things that you spoke to now, people are not aware. So is there a framework that is available to ensure that there's, maximum or optimal awareness drives?
Yes. PAN is a national body and it has zonal and state chapters. Okay, I am the coordinator for Enugu State. Okay, and I coordinate with two other consultants, one from Parkland, one from UNTH, Dr. Obijiako from Parkland, and Dr. Narado from UNTH. And then we even have one of the states, the national ESCO from our state, Dr. Ayuk, okay, Professor Ayuk. So PAN is a well-structured organization embodying all the pediatricians in the country. Okay, and PAN has its structure from the national to the state level. Now, PAN's major role is advocacy for issues that border on children, because these are the people that we protect. Okay, so advocacy is purely for children. And now, on a part of PAN's activity, PAN has a subcommittee on pneumonia, and that PAN subcommittee on pneumonia also has a national committee down to the states, and that's why we are here today. So the advocacy, the problem PAN is having is that PAN doesn't have enough support. PAN is calling for support from NGOs, from philanthropies, from persons that can fund and support PAN's activities, but they are little or none. This year alone, a lot of things that we mapped out, we could not execute them. To reach out to the community, to go to health centers in rural areas, to create awareness, we can't. Okay? So we're here because Signature TV has given us opportunity, free of charge, to discuss this. And so we ask other television stations, other radio stations to give such opportunities. We call on people, NGOs, multinationals, to support the role PAN is playing in ensuring that the awareness creation, it doesn't just end on November 12th as a 1 day or 1 week activity. Let there be a constant program that gets down to the grassroots. Let there be activities that are deliberate, that can inculcate the awareness. Let people know what is expected. Because people just think, oh, firewood is cheap. Gas is costly. Let me buy fire. They don't know the consequences. People don't also know the problems that come from overcrowding. People don't know why they should eat what they cultivated. Somebody will cultivate vegetables and fruits, sell it in the market, and go and buy a loaf of apple or whatever, or buy biscuits for the child.
Now apple came to your mind.
You understand? So there are issues there. So if people understand what it means, they understand the importance of vaccines, okay, good nutrition, awareness creation, a lot will change. And of course, other sectors will need to change because the health sector cannot just come out, stand alone when other sectors are ill.
Absolutely.
What are the underlying issues? I'm talking about specifically. Do you think there are the underlying health problem of a child would increase the risk of someone contracting pneumonia?
Yeah, definitely. There are so many. Take, for example, a child that has a heart problem, be it a heart defect that the child came up with from birth. That child is at increased risk of having a pneumonia. Okay, a child that has been having recurrent illnesses over time, diarrheal diseases, febrile illnesses, that child's immunity drops. That child coming down with pneumonia will be a lot more devastating. A child that is malnourished, malnutrition alone increases the likelihood of a bad outcome from pneumonia for about 30%. Wow. Just malnutrition alone. So when you see a child that is well nourished and has pneumonia, and a child that is malnourished and has pneumonia, that child that is well nourished has a lot more chance of coming out from that pneumonia than the child that is malnourished. Then we'll look at the availability of resources to even treat the case with pneumonia. How many of our hospitals have piped oxygen? How many of our PHCs have oxygen cylinders and tubes to connect them? How many of them have pulse oximeters to check saturation? What is percentage saturation of oxygen in the body? How many of them have the technical know-how to even decide, oh, this respiratory rate is high for this child requires supplementation? How many of them have the little basic skills to even know this person needs to be referred? How many of our children can actually transport the children to bigger facilities when there is need? These are all the issues. Before they talk about even making the diagnosis in the first place, how many of our workers at the PHC level can make a diagnosis of pneumonia?
How can a child's immune system be boosted to stave off this pneumonia? Well,
basically, let's start from the basic things, which is the nutrition. That is the basic thing.
What kinds of food?
Yes,
make up
so
the nutrition?
Definitely, you talk about fruits and vegetables, you talk about our protein in the right proportion.
Which type? Is it eggs? Is it...
Egg remains the standard protein from whichever other protein is rated. Egg is the standard protein from whichever other protein source is rated. Okay, so whether it is animal or plant source, fine. They have their merits and demerits, and so they are combined. Okay, and then you talk about fruits and vegetables. The problem we have is that we have a large proportion of carbohydrates and little or no protein and fruits and vegetables. So it's almost like a monocolor plate. And then secondly, when the food is prepared, you don't give children, 3 or 4 children in a home, you put one plate of food for them and say, let them eat together as a family, that they are siblings, so that they will love each other. No. Every child should have their separate plates, their separate servings, so that I will know what A ate and what B ate. If you serve children together in a plate, the senior ones will finish the food, the younger ones may have just taken 1 or 2 spoons. And then in your mind, the entire children have eaten. And after some months, it begins to show. You understand? And then what is more, how do you prepare these meals? Things that you can cook and they benefit a lot from the nutrients in it, most mothers will go and fry them. Think about the egg you mentioned. And an egg that is boiled is far more nutritious than the one that is roasted or fried or whatever they do, omelets and what have you. But again, that's what they will prefer to do. They see it as, oh, it is better, that is more modern. But that's not the truth. The same thing with our vegetables that they will blanch and over blanch. It's either they don't wash it well and then you introduce germs along with the vegetable, or they now over blanch it and you lose the nutrients that are in it. These are all issues. So the problems are there. The information on how to utilize them is one. Having them available is another. Mixing them at the right proportion is another thing.
All right, doctor, we'll have 2 minutes to round up, but there's something I wanted to speak to. There's tuberculosis, there's pneumonia, and then there's asthma. What is the striking difference?
Well, for asthma, there is nothing. The asthma typically will not give you a fever. Asthma giving you a fever means that there may be an infective cause that is triggering the asthmatic attack.
Reaction.
Okay, so if that is the case, you also have to watch out, look out for the infection and treat it. Because if you are trying to handle the asthma alone, the infective cause will not allow you to have a response from that asthma, except if you're handling the two together.
I'm very finally.
That is what. And then, of course, we talked about TB and pneumonia. These are things that, from what you hear on the chest, the symptomatology, you should be able to tease that. And then your investigations.
Great. There are some people that speak to pain when they breathe in and breathe out, especially behind them. What does that
when
speak
to? That's chest pain. That's an inflammation of the covering of the lungs. When it's inflamed, as you breathe and the lung tissue rubs on it, it gives you a lot of pain because that covering is inflamed from the infection, the pneumonic process. Again, when there is fluid in that space, that covering of the lung, what we call effusion.
And it's caused by an infection.
Yes, from the infection. The lining of that space is secreting a lot of fluid because of the infection that is taking place. The child find it difficult to lie on that side. Okay, as they breathe, they feel pain by the sides, and then you see them inclined to one side because of the pain. They are trying to counter that. Anything that stretches that covering gives them pain. So these are well-known things. And when you listen to the chest and look at the history of what they have, it's always very clear. Most diagnosis of pneumonia is purely by the bedside.
Right.
And when in doubt or anything that there are complications, you can do your chest X-ray to help you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Nduagubam. We wish we had you here longer, but then there are other opportunities. Thank you
so much.